Hi, welcome to Blank Canvas. My name is Maureen Newton and we're in my studio, Inspire Studio in beautiful downtown Medicine Hat. And today I'm going to be showing you an oil painting study, kind of a section of a painting that I already completed. And the painting is right here. And I do love painting animals. They're probably my most favorite thing to paint. So today I'm going to be using this as my reference, which is just a little cat. And a lot of the paintings I do are animals, dogs and cats, so they're quite fun, kind of not too stressful to paint. I'm going to be using oils today, so I have my supplies here, and because my colors are basically monochromatic, I'm using primarily the earth colors. So I have them out here on my glass palette, and I'm using solvent here, just dipping my brush in that. And for me, I use a real layering process. So for this is more of a wet into wet, a quicker study for me. Most times I spend a few weeks on my paintings. So it's a little bit different than how I normally paint, but just kind of gives you an idea of how to build up your canvas and your painting. So for me, it's a little bit like building a structure. You start with the layout, the foundation, the building blocks of color. You get into the details and then the finishing details. So what I'm going to do is start with a dark sort of layout, and mostly in oil painting I'm just picking up a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I'll name the colors as I'm using them here. Ultramarine blue and burnt umber, when you mix those two colors together, they primarily become your black or your dark. Using black is one thing you generally want to avoid in painting, and particularly in oil painting, because it really just muddies up your whole palette. These colors also dry fairly quickly, so the difference basically between acrylic painting and oil painting, for example, is acrylic paintings would be dry in anywhere from 15 minutes to perhaps an hour, depending on how thickly you're painting. Whereas oil paints would take anywhere from a couple of days up to a couple of weeks, again, depending on how thickly you're using them. So these two colors mixed together, the ultramarine blue and the burnt umber, create this lovely dark. And this is what I'm going to use for my initial layout. And I don't sketch or anything first. I always encourage students to kind of jump right in with the brush. I don't use pencil or anything to lay out, but there's many ways of approaching a painting. So when I'm looking at this, I'm basically just starting with my oval shapes. So I have the cat's head here. So I'm just kind of roughly saying this is about where that initial oval shape is going to be. And from there, the ears. And I'm doing this fairly lightly because with oil paint, I don't want to have a whole bunch of paint on there that's going to continually mix in with everything else that I have going on, and especially when I start to get my light colors. And I'm not a real literal painter where I want it to look exactly the same. My reference is really just a jumping off point or kind of a divining point. So I'm making this a little bit probably bigger than the photo itself here. And there's always elements in the photo. For example, in this one, there's a branch that kind of comes through the head of the cat. And those are the sorts of things, sometimes it's called artistic license. You want to maybe take those things out. They're not necessarily that important, or they're somewhat distracting kind of to your finished image. So I'm just going around almost just drawing with my brush, and I kind of move around and find the shapes of the areas. So basically the paws here, the legs, and I'll map out for myself where the major areas are going to be. So up here, the eyes, a little bit closer to the top of the head. It's going to look a little bit like a space alien cat at first here. The mouth itself. Now the solvent I use is an odorless paint thinner. It's an artist quality, and I generally keep the lid on it when I'm not using it. It is a very low odor, but it is toxic, so you want to make sure that you do use oils when you're using solvents in a well-ventilated area. So just by dipping my brush in the solvent, you can see that it gets a little more liquid and a little bit more intense in the color, so you can kind of see it a little bit better. So as I'm going here, I'm just going to get the basic areas mapped in for myself, and then I'll start getting some of the other background colors in. So this animal has quite a few little stripes in that, and I just sort of indicate for myself where those are going to be. This is kind of like a little road map for me, and basically, you know, one half of this is going to be a little bit more in shadow than the other half. And now in oil painting, when you're doing this kind of painting where it's more all in one sitting, it's called Alla prima. And when you do layers, it's called glazing. So this is kind of like an Alla prima study where it would still be working the wet into the wet kind of approach for painting. When you let those specific areas dry a little bit more and then you put layers on top, that's a slightly different but longer approach, and it can take, you know, months or weeks to kind of do that. So with oil painting, the basic principle is called fat over lean. So you want to put your fastest drying colors down first, which this blue and brown combo is, and from there put your slower drying colors on. So these particular colors would take about, like I was saying, a couple of days to be completely dry, depending how thickly I'm using them. And white, for example, takes probably about 5 to 7 days to dry. So that's one of the colors that you want to put on closer to the very end. So I kind of have my little cat mapped out here. And you really want to look for the distance between things. So we want this cat to look like he's looking up. So we want to make sure that the eyes are kind of closer to the top of his head. And anything, these, once I start painting, I'll be able to erase or change them just by painting over top. So say if I didn't like where I put that initial line, with oil painting, I can simply put my rag into my solvent and just erase by using my solvent to wipe that out a little bit. So I'm never too stressed about what I've done. I like to move things around a little bit as I go, and in the end it kind of all contributes to the overall painting. There we go. So now that I've got that pretty much mapped out, I'm just going to add a little bit more of a red brown, which is called burnt sienna, and just a little hint of white here. I'm just going to start to get in some of these other colors. And this is the very beginning. This initial part with my brush is just called the layout. Now when I start to just block in some of these colors, it's called the building blocks of color. So now I'll just start building up the layers of my canvas here. And some of these will, I'm just adding a little bit of red just to kind of add a little more interest in here. And just working on the canvas, it gets, you know, it's a little bit dry. So this is called the drag of the paintbrush. And I'll just continue to build up those little areas of color. I can see it's a little bit more red up in here. I'm just kind of looking around and see where else in this image can I sort of introduce some of these colors as I get going. Now, one thing I really like to do is to get my negative space filled in. So the object that you're painting is obviously your positive space, and any sort of spaces in behind that define our your negative space. And in painting, negative defines positive and positive defines negative. So they're always equal. One is equally as important as the other. So for me, I really enjoy painting the negative spaces. And I'm just going to pick up this blue color. I'm going to simplify it a little bit more just because of the amount of time that we have for this. But I'm taking cobalt blue, which is a little bit more like a sky blue, slightly different than the blue that I started with for my layout. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of white. Now the really nice thing about oil paint, because it takes so long to dry, you can really blend a lot with it. And now I'm just going to kind of go around and paint this blue space behind this cat here. And as I'm looking, I'm just not filling around what I drew initially. What I'm doing is redefining the shape of the cat. So I'm looking at my reference. And the reason why I like to use a reference quite often, I do paint from my imagination as well, but it really gives you the opportunity to study where the highlights and the distinct shapes are. So I notice as I'm painting the negative space now, there's sort of more of a little detail in on the ear, and so kind of defining the shape of the head a little bit more. Now with oil paint as well, because it's still wet, you can quite frequently pick up that color a little bit, and you just have to work that in. That's a common feature of oil paint, where you get that blending of color. And because this, like I said, if you wanted to blend a little more white into that or anything, you can lighten it right on the actual canvas. Now I like to use a little visual tool where I'll sometimes lighten in around the head of a person or animal that I'm painting. So kind of give it that sort of glowing halo effect. Now I said with artistic license, obviously I'm ignoring this branch. It's kind of cutting through the cat's head here. But whatever you decide to include, like I said, just because I'm simplifying this somewhat. But I like the effect sort of the two tree trunks kind of framing creating a little frame for the animal to kind of make it stand out a little bit more. So as I go around, this particular brush stroke I always call the flip-flop. So you go back and forth like this, and it's great for filling in larger areas. So I use a flat brush for this. The brush that I used for the original layout was just a smaller round brush, and it just kind of gives you a different mark that you make. But this brush is a little bit nicer for filling in larger areas. I mean, this obviously isn't a huge canvas here, but you want to use a brush size that is appropriate to the task at hand. So smaller round brushes are great just for doing smaller strokes and outlining areas. Quite often people use brushes that are just a little bit too small for filling in, and much more suitable for. There we go. So for example, this is the great thing about oil. If I wanted to darken up this area a little bit, I could just pick up more of my cobalt blue and just kind of fill that in a little bit more. Or you can pick up, a little bit white. And so this is the nice thing. This is the struggle that people have with acrylics, is that they dry so quickly that the blending part is just the paint dries so quickly that people really don't have a chance to do this. So with oil, we probably got an entire full day where I can still keep adding and blending to this background. So the greatest gift about it is also the greatest frustration, because now as I continue to work, I might find that this gets more cracks in the tree here as I'm working. I might find that I wanted to add branches in here or something, and now that I've got all this blue filled in, it's gonna keep blending and kind of be frustrating for me as I'm working. So I'm just getting some of these crack shapes in here a little bit, suggesting the bark of the tree. And let's get some of these on this side. So I'm always looking around to seeing what else, I can add with whatever I have on my brush at that moment. So I've just picked up a little bit more of my initial dark, and I'm just suggesting some of these dark shapes in the cat's paws here, and they'll have that sitting right on the edge. All right, so now I'll start bringing in some of the other colors in the face itself. And because I've got some of the earth colors here, I'm going to just bring in a little bit more of some of the yellows. Now, I always say painting is more about seeing colors that sometimes aren't there. You might look at something that's quite monochromatic and actually seeing color where there's not. I'll add a little bit of yellow in here just to brighten it up a little bit. I made this a little bit more of the reddy brown, but I'm just going to tone that down a little bit as I go. And just start kind of filling in. You always want to remember that the finishing details basically are coming at the very end. Get a little bit more white in there. And the nice thing is, as you're working, it's not set in stone. You can always change things around a little bit. If you feel like your initial layout was a little bit off, then you can just shift things up. Like, if this little part of the mouth, I didn't quite like where it was and I needed to shift it up a little bit, can just kind of fill that over. So with oil painting, the trick is to actually float your color on top. So as you're working, when you hold your brush actually parallel to your canvas, you're laying the color on top, and when you hold your brush perpendicular to, you're actually blending with what's underneath. So we'll just kind of work on getting some of these little areas filled in, and then we'll get a little bit more of that detail. I really love this reference picture because it kind of has one half of this little guy more in highlight and one half a little bit more in shadow. So said painting is about planes of light meeting planes of dark, and just sort of painting in all the little pieces of your jigsaw puzzle, and then as you stand back it gets a little bit more joined together, so the person looking at it, actually stepping back, sees the pieces all joined together and can perceive what it is. But when you're up close painting, it quite frequently doesn't look like as much as interesting as it does when it's a little farther away. So that's why when you're painting, you always want to step back and have a look at what you're working at. So because I already have a little bit of this earth color in here, now I can work on top and kind of blend into that. A lot of people will look at their paintings and feel a little bit kind of distressed because it doesn't look like anything yet, but it always just takes a while before the image kind of starts to get cemented in. And the other thing you want to do is look at your painting through half-closed eyes. So you squint up, and then your areas of value become a little bit more apparent to you. So there I'm just floating the color on top a little bit. See if I can get a little bit more of that burnt sienna in there and get a little bit more of that dark side over here. And going back in and just kind of looking around, seeing where else I can kind of add that color in. What makes something actually look like it's three-dimensional is not always the lines that you've created, but the shadows that you've created around it. So right now this is looking a little bit flat, but as I get more of those little highlights and darks in there, it'll start to stand out. Get a little bit more of the highlights in there. Starting to come together a little bit better here. And as I'm looking at it, I'm starting to develop the highlight over here, and I'm starting to push the darks on the other side. And I just want to add a little bit more blue down here. Change that shape a little bit. So you'll notice as I'm using my brush, I am constantly kind of flipping it and rotating it. And that's just because the way that you load the paint on your brush, quite frequently you want to keep the paint down off the ferrule. So as I'm using my brush on the side, I'm kind of taking a little bit of that brush paint that's closer to the tip, and I'm kind of creating those lines that way. And when I hold it this way, I'm just kind of getting that paint blended into the texture of the canvas itself, all the little grooves. So a lot of these little white parts that you can see right now, those will get filled in as I'm working here. So get a little bit more highlight on that, and we're starting to get a little bit more interesting shapes here. So I would say probably just once I get this little section filled in, that I'd be close to halfway finished. I'm just gonna get a little bit of these areas filled in, and then what we'll just put on top are the finishing details. So this construction of the painting, the little details at the very end, the highlights in the eyes and the nose, all of those little things will really make those details pop out. Just get a little bit more of this highlight here on this foot. So we're almost finished. The underpainting. And then let's drag that little bit out there. So that's the end of part 1. I'm going to continue with this in part 2 and include all the finishing details. If you'd like to learn more about painting, you can find out more about Inspire Studio on our website at www.inspireart.ca. And there's a lot of other great places that teach classes in Medicine Hat. There's the Hat Art Club, the Strathcona Art Center, and also the Hive down the street from Inspire. So we'll see you in the next blank canvas.